before we begin the Khuluma part of the evening, Mary Burton would like to say a few words.
Thanks, Teresa. I just wanted to pay tribute to a very long-standing member of the Black Sash who died yesterday. Her name is Sue Philcox, and she was involved at our regional level, at national level. She was passionate about education. In fact, she was passionate about lots of things, a very lively person. Sadly, she had had Alzheimer's for a very long time, and her husband died a few months ago. So I think her family is grateful that their lives have now come to a peaceful end. But we just really remember her and all that she did for the Black Sash and all the things she cared about. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. So roughly our program for this evening is going to be that each of our speakers will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for engagement and unpacking the issues that they've brought and maybe some issues that we want to raise as well. So I'd like to just introduce, let me do the introductions right through, and then the three of you can kind of run things from there. So our first speaker will be Valencia Talene from Corruption Watch. And Valencia has worked as a journalist for Corruption Watch since its inception in 2012. Over the 7 years, she has covered stories relating to corruption in government institutions and state-funded agencies, focusing on areas such as education, health, social services, and public procurement. She has helped unveil systemic gaps in public sector programs and projects that impact on ordinary South Africans. She is driven, like many others in civil society, by its social justice mandate. Valencia has also been part of Corruption Watch's Reports Management Committee for several years. Part of the committee's work is to manage the progress of complaints from the public, from which the organization gets its data to inform campaigns and projects as well as investigations. Prior to joining Corruption Watch, Valencia worked as an online journalist for the Mail and Guardian and the New Age Online. So a warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for coming. Our second speaker will be Tracy Ledger, who holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of the Witwatersrand and an M.Com from Stellenbosch University. Her main research interest is the analysis of institutional failure in the public sector, on the basis that the study of failure provides better insights into causality than does the study of so-called best practice. Her work is based mainly in local government and focuses on developing new theoretical frameworks with which we can interpret institutional outcomes. She is particularly interested in the relationship between exogenous legislative innovation — I'm going to leave her to explain what that is — and endogenous institutional factors and the ways in which the latter undermine the former.
Just a fancy way to impress other academics.
But a very warm welcome, and we're glad both of you made it from Johannesburg in the midst of all the challenges with airlines, etc. And then our final speaker will be Naushina Rahim, who is a legal researcher at Open Secrets and also works in this capacity for the Secretariat of the Civil Society Working Group on State Capture, which is a coalition made up of over 20 civil society organizations taking a stand against corruption at the expense of human rights. The working group has supported the work of the Zondo Commission of Inquiry by making submissions to it and ensuring oversight of the Commission and other key anti-corruption agencies. Naushina has a master's degree in law from the Dullah Omar Institute and has trained with the Legal Resources Centre in Cape Town. She is currently working towards bringing the second People's Tribunal on Economic Crime together. These 2020 hearings will focus on exposing corrupt actors in the minerals energy complex sector. So warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for coming, Naushina.
Good evening, everybody. Valencia here. Further away from my face. It's a tricky one. It's a very interesting case that's quite fascinating that Corruption Watch has been involved in since 2014, actually. But instead of going from the beginning to the end, what I'll do is I'll start in the middle. I'll tell the story in an interesting way. I'll start in the middle and then go back to the beginning and then come back to the end. And I'd like for everyone to keep in mind that the case that we're going to be talking about today, which is when it started really when Corruption Watch realized that CPS, the former service provider for SASSA, the grants distributor, entered into an unlawful contract first with SASSA, and then later SASSA approved and made a payment of an amount of 316 million to CPS that has been found to be unlawful by not only the Gauteng High Court, but also the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein. And without messing up the structure of my story, let me start in the middle. Corruption Watch in June of 2014 found out about this payment. It had just been made from SASSA's account to the CPS's account. How we found out was that the parent company of CPS is US based and it's called Net1. It has a longer name than that. I can never remember the full name, but they're called Net1. And because they are listed on both the Johannesburg Securities Exchange as well as NASDAQ, they had a reporting duty in that they had to say how much money they had made from their contract with the South African entity that is SASSA. And in that announcement of theirs, we picked up that they sort of, in this instance, sort of bragged that they had made something like 275 million rands before tax through their SASSA contract. And specifically, the money was for the process of re-registering social grant beneficiaries on their already existing system. And when Corruption Watch started to inquire with SASSA how it justifies making that kind of payment, that amount of money, where the need for that kind of payment came from, SASSA became a little evasive with us, and they would not let us know. So we were at the point where the two entities first established a relationship between each other. CPS gets appointed in January of 2012, and in February, the very next month, the contract is signed between the two parties. That also, and also the service level agreement is adopted as far as how the two parties are to work together. It's the very nature of the contract then that becomes the subject of a constitutional court. I'm used to calling it Concord. Constitutional court ruling later the following year, which declares it unlawful, in the sense that because, well, for reasons related to the tender, the process where, along with all other bidders, CPS was tendering for the contract, and was seen to have the contract that they ended up with getting into SASSA with, and was declared to have been to have had an unfair advantage for CPS over other bidders. And in June of that year, that's when CPS and SASSA now are sitting around a table in a meeting and discussing how they're going to organize the re-registration program that SASSA had begun to research and to find out how they were going to do it. And it's that meeting that's quite crucial because it becomes the center of further litigation later on that says, at that meeting, what really transpired. SASSA says, me and us and CPS went into an agreement that says they may re-register people and charge us money after they have done so. And the courts would later say, especially the Supreme Court of Appeal, would say to them, at no point in that meeting were you guys agreeing on anything like that. So it shouldn't have been that an amount of 316 million ended up leaving the fiscus and leaving government when it should have been that the very re-registration process of beneficiaries by CPS should have been catered for by the original contract entered into in early 2014. So Corruption Watch fought the very principle of how do you come back and say, after you've signed a contract and you have a service level agreement to the extent that every newcomer onto the system gets registered by CPS and becomes a beneficiary of the social grants program, and yet you are willing to pay the same service provider a certain amount of money decided by themselves without any consultation with government, and want to justify that it's okay to operate in that way. So in March of 2015, Corruption Watch then went to court, to the High Court in Gauteng, and said the application there was for the whole the agreement between the perceived agreement between CPS and SASSA to pay for SASSA to pay 360 million to CPS for that to be set aside. And about 3 years later, 2018, the court rules that it was indeed an unlawful agreement. It rules that, in fact, Corruption Watch was correct in its assertion that CPS should never have asked for extra money for re-registering people when its original contract with SASSA was already catering for such a process. And of course, in the true nature of the relationship that CPS had with government, they launched an appeal with the Supreme Court of Appeal, which then goes on to, even though it says, it renders the same agreement unlawful, it focuses, the Supreme Court of Appeal says, we needn't even look at whether or not you guys had a variation agreement to begin with. What you guys have is a contract, unlawful as the Constitutional Court may have declared it back in 2014, was it? The fact remains that that contract stands as a contract that allows SASSA to ask CPS to keep registering new beneficiaries as and when they come onto the system. It doesn't need to pay any extra money for that to happen, and CPS has no right to dictate to the South African government how much you need to pay us without even negotiating for a good deal. So in essence, what the two court processes ended up revealing for us is that SASSA did not act in the best interest of the public, of the ordinary South African when they, one, entered into the contract that they did with CPS back in 2012, in the beginning of 2012, and later when they allowed CPS to bulldoze the process of re-registration using perhaps a loophole that they found in the original service level agreement to bulldoze SASSA into agreeing to pay them money, just so that they tick all the boxes that they need to tick with the US authorities without considering what is in the best interest of the South African public. Where the matter stands now, when the Supreme Court of Appeal said, no ways, we're not even going to consider, not only are we considering that, are we ruling in your favor, but we're also asking you to pay, well, the High Court has said CPS must pay the money back to SASSA. And of course, our executive director wished we would get some of that as well, because had it not been for our court action, we wouldn't be where we are today. But the Supreme Court of Appeal upheld that particular element of that judgment, and went on to say CPS should pay the legal costs for Corruption Watch's efforts in bringing them to court. As the matter stands at this point, CPS has taken the matter further than the Supreme Court to the Constitutional Court, and they are hoping that the Constitutional Court, I don't know through which avenue of constitutional law, but they are hoping that the Constitutional Court will find an element of constitutional value in their argument that they shouldn't be asked to pay back this money.
I'd like to just pick up on some of the things mentioned about the SASSA case. So my work or my role is a researcher in a coalition, a civil society coalition called the Civil Society Working Group on State Capture. And what this working group has aimed to do over the past year is to make sure that it kind of works together with the Zondo Commission of Inquiry on State Capture. So I'm sure you've seen maybe on news now and then, Judge Zondo, this one is coming to testify in front of Judge Zondo and give sort of information to the Commission on their role in state capture. And I think the SASSA case is a very important case because it highlights how corruption, when public bodies, when our state officials are not doing the jobs they're supposed to be doing, and using their powers to sort of make deals with private actors to enrich each other, enrich themselves, this really has a bad effect on the people on the ground. And like looking at the SASSA case, I mean, the SASSA function is to pay social grants. And without the social grants, you've got elderly people, children, single parents, disabled people, everyone that's really facing the impact of not getting their money. And I think that's why this case is so important, because it really reflects the impact that we hear about the crimes and the you said 315 million? 60. Yeah, that, for contracts, and they're not delivering on that contract, and then taking 3 years with the case to sort of get some answer from the court. And during that time, the lives of millions of South Africans are kind of swaying in that balance, waiting for an answer. So one of the outputs of the working group has been to give submissions. So each organization, there's about 20 or more organizations that have come together and so there's people working on education rights, on like the SASSA, Corruption Watch. There's a huge amount of organizations that have been able to make writing based on the work that they've done, on the cases and people that are working and coming to them, and they've been able to write submissions and give this information to the Commission, hoping that the Commission will then act on what's been given to it. But I think we have to be also very mindful that the Commission itself is not the cure to all of our problems. Judge Zondo, respectfully so, has a mandate, and that's to hear evidence, to make recommendations. NPA, please do this. Hawks, you need to go investigate more. Parliament, please have more oversight or better oversight. So those are kind of the recommendations that the Zondo Commission will make. But it's up to us as civil society, up to us as the public, to kind of continue having these conversations. It's not just about 2 million or 3 billion, and now it's even trillions that I'm hearing in the news. It's not about that. It's about the people whose lives are being affected by it. And that's kind of why this conversation can't just start and end with just one case or one commission. It's something we have to be mindful of all the time. Sorry, I'm going off my topic a little. I feel very passionate about this. So coming back to the work of the Civil Society Working Group. So on the SASSA case specifically, we have brought together the various submissions that I've mentioned and brought the recommendations. So every organization has written to Judge Zondo, please can you do this, this, and this. If you can, within your powers, please can you do this and this and this. So those things are collated in what we call a joint submission. And I'm going to read out to you just a little bit on particularly the SASSA case and also other cases which includes the right to education, a safe learning environment, and the right to access healthcare as well. So we've identified some of like key issues that are like running through all the cases. Like you see that in the procurement processes, there's a lack in transparency and a lack in accountability. So what I mean is no one really, the public isn't being kept up to speed on the decisions that is being made behind closed doors. How do you and I as public who's paying tax money and expecting a service back from a government that's tasked with providing a service to people, how are we able to know or be part of the processes? So there needs to be this transparency created so that we can engage in these processes and ask questions and get answers. And then we also highlighted that there's accountability that's missing. And particularly in the procurement processes, so people are awarding tenders without following the proper procedure. And there is laws like the Public Finance Management Act which will say, well then if so-and-so is doing this, then this is the punishment or punitive measure for them. But that doesn't happen. We see that's not happening, and that's why there's a continuance of this kind of behavior and a culture of this behavior. So this is one of the recommendations to the Zondo Commission, where we ask for an increase in transparency and accountability in procurement processes specifically, because that's sort of become the new vehicle to where state capture happens and corruption runs rife. The other recommendation, or point 2 recommendation, is looking at appointment and dismissal processes. So what we find is that a lot of people are appointed not because they are qualified for their position, but maybe because they might know someone or have a family member, or maybe even just hiring someone knowing that they would turn a blind eye or to some of the which you as a leader may be doing, or just follow your command without questioning you. So this is the kind of thing we've been seeing happening. And similarly, people that are standing up for what's right in organizations are losing their jobs. They're facing intimidation. There's no safety for them. They get threatened, they get fired, they get harassed. So I think looking at appointment processes and dismissal processes is something that's very key to kind of grappling with some of the corruption that's happening, particularly in cases like SASSA. And I just want to, I need to wrap up. So I'm just going to briefly mention, so the thing about safety and having a safe platform, I think, for people that want to speak out if they see corruption happening is some of the recommendations. So we want a more safer environment and safer laws in place to ensure the safety of whistleblowers. So whistleblower protections need to be increased. And there's an introduction of something called a key term principle, which means if someone's going to come forward as a whistleblower, then at least there'll be some sort of incentivized program. So to kind of make it more attractive in a way to come forward and speak out about what's right. And the last thing, very briefly, is there's also recommendations for legal reform, which I'm sure my colleagues can actually speak better to, which is from the SASSA case and some of the laws that where there's gaps allowing for some of these corruptions to take place. So thank you very much for allowing me that time. Yes.
I'm at the Public Affairs Research Institute at Wits University, and we've been doing a lot of work on state capture since that first report, The Betrayal of the Promise. And I think just to take a wider look is what state capture does. I mean, the first thing that we say is, like, corruption wasn't invented by the Guptas. It's not something new. Corruption is something that's been in place for hundreds of years in this country, and I think it's important that we see the historical continuity of that. But what the work on state capture does is it gives us the opportunity to take a closer look at our state and at its institutions. Because when you look at the institutions of the state, whether it's a municipality or a provincial department or SASSA, it's not that they're not doing anything. Those institutions are full of people running around doing things, but they're not doing the things that are furthering the developmental state. Those institutions are not prioritizing the people who are prioritized in the Constitution. So what we have to ask is why is that? What is going on in institutions, and how do we reorient our institutions so that their outcomes are working to promote transformation and redress for social justice? And I think one of the first things to ask is who has power in these institutions, and to whom are these institutions accountable? And what we find a lot of the time, and once again, whether it's a local municipality or whether it's SASSA, the people to whom these institutions should be accountable in terms of the Constitution are not the people to whom they are accountable. So what we have is effectively what has happened in a lot of state institutions is that accountability is to the NEC of the ANC. This is where accountability really lies. And this is underpinned by the relationship between politicians and institutions. So in terms of the Public Service Act, whether it's the MEC or whether it's the minister, they've got the absolute right to appoint every single person in that institution, in that department. So the Minister of Public Service and Administration has got the legal right to appoint every single person in that department, from the DG down to the person who makes the tea. And there was a good historical reason for that. When the ANC came to power in 1994, they inherited a bureaucracy that wasn't that keen on transformation. So they needed to be able to exercise political authority, extensive political authority over the bureaucracy. But what has happened is that has become greatly undermined. And we see that power being abused in state-owned enterprises as well, where the minister's got the absolute right to appoint the board, the CEO, and everybody down there. So what happens then is that the accountability in those institutions then becomes upwards instead of down to the people that those institutions are being should be serving. Now, we don't say, there's a lot of people that say, okay, we must have a completely neutral public service. We don't believe that at all. There's a definite political agenda to be implemented in South Africa. We don't want a neutral public service. We want a biased public service, but we want them biased in the right way. We want them biased in favor of transformation and social justice and redress for the past. So that's the first thing. How do we have checks and balances on this political power so that institutions focus on delivering their constitutional mandates? I think the second thing that that we need to have a conversation about in this country is what exactly is corruption. So we would all know that if the municipal manager appoints his neighbor's daughter as his PA that's corruption. But if Standard Bank retrenches 5,000 people just so that the management can have a bigger bonus, that's not corruption. That's just good business. And somebody said to me, yeah, well, you know, the one's public money and the other one's private money. I said, but whose money it is has got nothing to do with the fundamental morality of the decision. And at the end of the day, it is public money. You know, who looks after those people when they can't afford a private medical aid anymore, or private education, or private whatever? It's a social cost. So when we start talking about the role of the private sector in corruption, I think we need to have a much broader discussion than just, you know, are they paying bribes to organizations? But how do we understand what is a socially just economy and who gets the right to make decisions over economic resources in society? I mean, I think it's corruption. I do quite a lot of work in food. I think it's corrupt to pay a small farmer in Harrismith R4.20 a litre for milk and then sell it to a woman who can't feed her child in the location for 15 Rand a litre. So I think this is an opportunity for us to have a much wider discussion about the kind of state and the kind of economy we want to have, rather than just these broad things of corruption. And then I think the other thing is, how do we identify the most effective levers to address corruption? So we are excellent in this country at writing new rules and regulations for everything. So one municipal manager said to me, he said, whenever there's a problem, Treasury makes a new rule for something. So we actually have an over-regulated state. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of rules for everything, from how to buy a new pen from the office to how to employ a person, whatever. The problem is not that we don't have rules. The problem is that people don't comply with the rules. And sometimes the more rules you've got, the easier it is for people not to comply with the rules. So procurement in the public sector is a good example. I tell you, if you work in a municipality and you try to procure anything, you'll want to kill yourself after 3 days, because the amount of paper and documents that you have to get. So people make mistakes. You easily make mistakes. So it's really difficult to comply. So in that environment, it's actually easy to be a crook, because it's so difficult to comply. So what we're doing in this country is we're applying as much regulatory pressure to who the MM appoints as their PA as to the project management of Madupi Unit 6. And this it's not working, and it imposes a huge cost on the country. So what we see is we find all these little municipalities in KwaZulu-Natal that get a clean audit, but they spend 75% of their budget on administration. So essentially they spend all their money to tell Treasury what they did with their money. I mean, this is not in the interests of a developmental state either. So there's some interesting work that's done by other researchers around the world, working mostly in Bangladesh, that are saying, look, in a country like South Africa, where there is such limited economic opportunity in the private sector, we cannot run ourselves ragged worrying about who the MM is having as the PA, or whether, you know, we paid an extra 10% to support a small business here. Let's understand what types of corruption are most detrimental to the achievement of a developmental state, and let's focus on those things. And obviously the payment of social grants and SASSA would be one of those things to focus on there. And then finally, I think that you know, we need to understand where corruption has a value chain. Everything has a value chain. Where in the corruption value chain can we intervene to have the greatest impact? And once again, one of the groups I think that we haven't paid enough attention to is the banking sector. So I know that I think it was ABSA or Standard Bank, or don't quote me if anyone hears from them. They're the ones that then said, oh no, we're going to be such good citizens, we're going to close down the Gupta's bank accounts. Okay, I missed that part where they gave back all the money they made on the Gupta's bank accounts. That I didn't see. You know, and banks know what's going on. They know if somebody comes and opens an account for a company and then the next day there's 50 million Rand but there's no employees. They know exactly what is going on. And nobody engages in corruption so that they can just like feel good about themselves. They do it for the money. And the only way you get money, unless like you get 50 bucks from a traffic cop, and nobody gets rich on 50 Rand from the metro police officer, it's got to go through the banking sector. So I think we also need to have a conversation about the role of the banking sector in facilitating these things and their responsibility in managing what goes on. But I think finally at the end of the day, you know, addressing the kind of corruption that impacts social grants doesn't come down really so much to technical solutions as much as it comes down to politics. It's the politics of who gets prioritized by the state and who doesn't get prioritized by the state. Back to local government. I spend a lot of time in local government. Nobody ever gets the procurement of the mayor's new car wrong. It always works absolutely beautifully because those are the incentives. So how do we, you know, to incentivize institutions to prioritize the needs of those who require the state the most is an issue of politics, not a technical issue. And I'll stop there.
In making its decision, the Commission should look, the Zondo Commission should look into, as Narina said, how people are appointed and how well versed they are in the fields that they are then set out to govern. And if I could put in my 2 cents worth, I would say that we all know that in terms of government structure, the more senior you go, the more the structure, the less permanent the appointments are. You get CEOs of SOEs, for instance, having 5-year terms. Or, well, when they do get contracted, eventually they're there for 5 years and stuff like that. The reason why I say this is this: in the case of SASSA and the very critical decision that the CEO at the time made in May of 2014 to pay off CPS 316 million that they shouldn't have, so that she shouldn't have, she was literally on her way out. It happened. The approval was signed off by her on the 22nd of May, and her contract was to end on the 31st of that very same month. And I would simply say, why not make, if a CEO of, say, SASSA, or a government agency, or any other entity for that matter that's structured the same way, should not be making decisions like that, especially on procurement, maybe, say, in the last 6 months of their term, the last year of their term, because they may just be making decisions that are not favorable for the organization they're leaving behind. And they probably, for one reason or other, they're looking to appease people who are not going to make sure that the interests of those who are served by the agency that they lead get what they need from them.
Virginia Peterson and Frank Earl, in fact, Virginia Peterson was responsible for the first debacle in terms of changing the tender specifications on very short notice that would only favor one partner with the capability of biometric authentication. You know? And so that change was the first, and she changed the specification from may to must, which resulted in an unlawful contract. So she's not even a year or so into the game. She's right in there, and she changes it. And then comes this second wave with more money going to CPS. So one of my questions is, what happens to these people who, they might either act individually, but I don't think that they act individually. There might be others sort of behind the scenes. What do you do with a Virginia Peterson and a Frank Earl, who eventually left and joined CPS? So that's my one question. The second question relates to the issue of CPS and whether Corruption Watch, with others, will pursue the blacklisting of that particular company. Because there's this one case, but there's also making an unlawful profits of the CPS contract when it was performing an organ of state. Now, I hear the slippery slope around the procurement, because often when when civil society organizations get involved, it's like when the contract was awarded. And so the questions are, what are the actual mechanisms for transparency and accountability that is built in? Because you might also end up with voluminous documents that you have to study, often technical in nature. So where is the point at which you are saying that there must be openness and transparency in the process? Nobody's talking about BEE and the fact that, in fact, this particular tender, part of it why they won it was because of a BEE component, which they never revealed. The BEE credentials, and often it's these BEE credential processes that takes us into a slippery road. And then I think the big thing for SASSA is, if you look at the governance structure of SASSA, you will see that the minister is in fact the operational person. Unlike in any other of the entities, she makes the decisions together with the CEO. We've seen that she's pulled back reports from the Constitutional Court. That's the powers that is vested in the Minister of Social Development in terms of SASSA. There is no board. There is no governance structure. There is no inspectorate that is supposed to come. So is there not a structural deficiency in some of these institutions that also allows for people to have too much concentrated powers that doesn't kind of benefit ordinary people in the system? Those are just a few questions that I want to ask.
I would imagine we had not envisaged that the litigation would take us as far as it has and as long as it has. But I can only hope that we get to sit at the end of whatever decision the Constitutional Court makes in terms of whether or not it wants to hear this. We're able to sit and devise ways that we can perhaps approach it. I don't think, as it stands, Corruption Watch would not be satisfied with just the courts saying pay back the money and with interest, and it ends there. But it also speaks to a culture in our criminal justice system, where the agencies that should be working together to pursue a parallel process and not wait for a court process to finish up before they start digging and putting together enough evidence to put perpetrators away, are simply not really doing it. I mean, the Zondo Commission has a few examples here and there where action has been taken, but they're too few and too far between, and they're not, much as it's not, it's a heavy burden on the Commission's shoulders to expect. The perceived understanding of it is that it should be that as people appear before the Commission, there's action happening and we know about it. For all we know,
action by whom? Can you
the
give us an
Hawks,
example?
the NPA.
Yeah.
So there seems to be that culture of not acting as things are rolling. And as far as your other point, I just need to remind myself here. The other point about us, whether or not we would love to pursue a blacklisting of CPS, I think it's depending on how I'll probably speak out of term here and say, I think if we can afford it, it should absolutely be on our agenda over the next few years, that we seek to make sure that the same company, this company that robbed the public sector of so much money, does not get to do the same in another sector again. And I should have made a disclaimer at the beginning, before I started speaking that at the time of our engagements with SASSA, in fact, throughout this whole debacle, one of my sisters happens to work for SASSA and was in the same unit as Frank Earl. In fact, she reported to Frank Earl. So we would get, from time to time, we get insight into, every time we poke, what the reaction is on the other side, because we needed to know, are they frazzled? Are they even worried about what's coming? And it would seem not so. It was more CPS's home ground than it was government entity. I mean, the boldness with which CPS operated and engaged SASSA seems to be a story on its own. You know, it's one of those things where it may be that from where we sit, a government agency such as SASSA should have known what its mandate is, and in bringing in a private sector company into the picture. But one has to step back and ask if SASSA was not always envisaged as just a vehicle for this private sector company to come make as much money as it can before it leaves and gets away with it. The judiciary was our last resort, and hopefully Concord will just throw out the case as an opportunistic case on their part, on the part of CPS.
Thanks, Valencia. Tracy?
You know, this question of SASSA as an agency, and should they have had a board, I mean, at the end of the day, it probably wouldn't have made that much difference, because the minister would have had their power to appoint everyone on the board anyway, dismiss everyone on the board whenever she wanted to, and to appoint the CEO and to dismiss them. So, and it's important to remember, it's not just the political authority in terms of appointing people, it's the political authority in terms of dismissing people. As well, and disciplining people. So in this country, the average life of a DG is about 22 months. So, you know, that's not just bad for corruption, it's bad for the institution operating properly. And it's one of the reasons why we have such a problem with government departments actually implementing policies, because you have this constant change of leadership. So there's kind of this whole middle layer of people in the organization that are like, oh, well, you here with your fancy new policy, who cares? You'll be gone in 18 months' time, so why bother to do anything? You know, and I think there's, you know, the other thing as well, when Valencia was talking about it, the Zondo Commission, about the NPA doing something and those things, what we need to understand, I think we've got a little bit in this country, a little bit of a cult of leadership. We think if we put a new leader in charge of an institution, everything will be changed. But what we don't realize is over the last kind of 10 years, there's this whole layer of senior management that's been put in place that is completely committed to the organization doing different things. And you find that in an organization, you'll go in there and there'll be guys, people understand you don't want to get promoted past the director level, because then you don't have to go on like a contract and that. But from that level, you can kind of organize what goes on. The best job to have in a department is the head of HR. And you have these whole departments where the head of department actually has absolutely no authority in that department whatsoever. So I think it's important in some of these key institutions that we go and have a look at that senior middle management of layers, all the people under the National Director of Public Prosecutions, and say, you know, are these fit and proper people for these posts? And in terms of procurement, you know, once again, I think it's a question of having a differentiated approach. You know, we've got a situation where you end up buying a fridge for the municipality at 3 times the price you could get it at Macro, because you've got to tick all the forms, but you can't, you know, you don't have access to skills to procure things properly. So I think what we need is a sort of a loosening of procurement in the kind of smaller things like the fridges and the stationery, but much more control over the kind of procurement that's really, really important for the country, like who gets to manage the SASSA contracts, and infrastructure projects and that, so that we have access to skills that are going to make a real difference in that area. I think a lot of the time we try and apply the same regulation to everything without thinking about that different things have got very, very different outcomes for people.
So I think a particular area where we feel a need for more transparency is in terms of the service level agreements. because what we're finding is this SASSA case actually set a precedent. The Constitutional Court set a precedent stating that where a private company is doing a function of a state department, then it should also meet the constitutional obligations of a state department. And I mean, with the in SASSA's case, I mean, that service to provide social grants, it's such a protected right in our constitution that really it was really important to make sure that whichever service provider is being not appointed but contracted to provide that service needs to meet those constitutional obligations and make sure that their services is up to standard so they don't take advantage of vulnerable people, which they've done in this case, CPS has done. And things like making data of people, just they've used it the way they felt, and yeah, I think Lynette might be able to speak more to that part as well. So I just wanted to say once again, so the service level agreements, I think one of the challenges in the cases is that they couldn't access the service level agreements of CPS service so civil society wasn't able to really tell whether the services were by CPS were meeting the obligations terms of the Constitution or just in any form, like what was the level of the services being provided. It was really hard to know that. So I think if we're calling for transparency and increased transparency in the future, in particular for private companies performing role of functions of state need to have more openness with regard to their service level agreements. And I think this goes also, it runs with our SOEs as well. The public is actually the main stakeholder of all of these entities. So we have the right to access the information from these companies. Yes, thank you.
I think, if I may start by saying, if we can change the system of electing people, because what is happening in this organization, even like, for example, the ruling party, they know they've got their 5 years. Ne? Like now, the 5 year is within Ramaphosa and his comrades, because now even there in the ANC, DA, there are camps, and then okay, let's leave them for their 5 years. Like even when they took off Mbeki was going for the 3rd term, but they said no, you can't have it, because Zuma have been waiting there for so long with his friends. You understand? So now what is happening for me, the only solution to these problems, if we can change the system of elections, now the president must be elected directly by the people from the ground. I think people from the ground, they know who to elect, instead of you just put X on ANC, then at the end of the day, who's going to choose someone to lead you? And then if we can just, as people on the ground, they put there the person on the ballot paper, then we said no, we know this guy is like this. Moses from like Zuma was coming from Ghana. He never did nothing for the people in Ghana before he became a president. So people on the ground automatically, they will know who to elect. No, we can't elect you because we never done nothing for us on the ground. Like even here in Western Cape, I'm farming in Mamre. DG of Land Reform came there and he promises us now there are farms in Grapo, in all these places where they are farming, in Talene, all over these places. No, we will take you next year and then we'll give you to see these farms and all these things. Only he knows that is going away from the seat next year, like this thing I'm saying. Someone come and promise to us, but he knows that now the other group is waiting outside to get in the seat. Next year when we came in, then we've got a meeting again, because now we're happy now because we are going to be shown these farms. No, came a new guy now, we must start again filling forms and all these things. we ask, where is that director? The director, no, the director now is gone from that seat. It's no more there. You understand? Now we end up now having a bad luck of having farms. So we end up now losing hope of we will ever have got farms. So that's why I'm saying if the panel can look at this, if we can change system of electing people, because now people are electing their own people like the Mutwaledi of today. Like now Mutwaledi found out he doesn't qualify to be there, but simply because it's a cadre. You understand? Like even SAA is collapsing now. Zuma put his girlfriend there as a head. You understand? So that's why I'm saying if we can elect our own people from the ground, then everything. Okay, sorry for that, because thanks.
It seems as if definitely corruption it's running deep now, and I've got friends of mine whom are working at SASSA, whom are staying in my township, that who are experiencing the corruption every day. But the thing is, they can't blow the whistles because they know if they can blow the whistles, it's either he loses his job or he's going to be threatened. So I just want to know if maybe there is a number, maybe if they can phone or just to talk about the corruption of SASSA also. Because they are willing to talk, but they can't talk to the manager or the superiors, because definitely they're going to be treated otherwise.
Are you able to say what? I think that the issues that was raised by PARI seemed to point to the question of institutional culture that facilitates state capture and corruption. And I make the deliberate distinction between state capture and corruption, because some of these things are politically orchestrated in order to capture a SASSA or a contract bigger than just petty crime on this level. So what is it that can be done around this question of institutional culture that makes it so easy for people? And I mean, there's lots of dynamics, and you certainly pointed to the fact that, in fact, the accountability is with the party and with the NEC, and so there's no accountability downwards. So the other issue is also around what mechanisms do one create for accountability or supporting people to become more accountable. So two questions around institutional culture and accountability.
So in terms of the institutional culture and institutional reform, I mean, the two things are related. People who work in institutions, like your friends that work in SASSA, South Africa is not a country you want to lose your job in, really. So it's fine to say, oh, you must be a superhero and do the right thing. But, if the choice is between, like, maybe someone's going to go to jail, but maybe not, and you can't feed your family anymore, that's a different kind of discussion. So we need to understand these things work. So, and obviously, the enormous amount of power that politicians have in these institutions is extremely problematic. So we did some work in the Gauteng Department of Health after the Life Esidimeni tragedy to understand exactly that, the organizational culture. And that's an organization full of, by and large, not bad people, but a lot of like terrified people, okay? Absolutely traumatized and distraught, and a very politically factionalized organization where to keep your job, you've got to, keep that politician happy and that politician happy. So it's about the incentives in the organization and the way in which this enormous power of politicians creates the wrong kind of incentives in organizations. And if we curb that, if we take this political discretion out of the appointment of people, so that we have a thing where people have to appoint from a short list that's selected by experts. And then once the head of the department is appointed, he or she is then responsible for appointing people. I mean, that's what happens in a normal institution. And you have clear rules for dismissing people in that. The contract, somebody raised the other thing, the contracts that people are on, the 5-year contract, especially in local government, all the Section 56 managers on the 5-year contracts. If you want to get rid of the MM, it's like really easy. You just pay out the contract. Let me tell you, you can say what you like about SAMWU, but if that municipal manager was a member of SAMWU, he wouldn't be going anywhere. So I think, that is very much the thing. And then electoral reform is absolutely key to these things, because until we have electoral reform, we don't have direct accountability, but also we have these incorrect incentives for institutions. So the thing now that the ANC says you must have a ward committee, a branch for every single ward. Okay, so every single ward has got a committee and has got a chairman of the committee. So all that happens in that municipality is the branches fight against each other for resources and people and whatever. And this is not a way to run an institution. You can't. It's extremely destructive. You incentivize people on their own interests. So electoral reform, I think, is critical to what goes on.
Without sounding like I'm marketing our campaigns, we also have a Corruption Watch has a leadership campaign, which is founded on the principle of, if the people want a leader of this caliber, then that shall be the leader that is appointed for that position. Our current focus areas have been the policing sector, in terms of the position of the National Police Commissioner, and I believe the head of the Hawks. So that even though the two positions are filled and are permanently filled, the idea behind the campaign is to instill in members of the public the culture of scrutinizing whether or not those incumbents are of the caliber that we want. Should their successors go the same route as they did? Should the people who are served by those leaders not have a say in how they are appointed and who gets appointed, as opposed to just having an announcement by a minister in that portfolio? You would have seen, I think it was last week sometime, when Parliament had interviews for the new Deputy Public Protector. Again, it was it was not necessarily initiated by Corruption Watch, but the previous process of a few years ago, 2016, was, and it yielded so many positive results, in the sense that the feedback from members of the public is that, how is it that this was never the case before? How is it that we have a public protector that we only got the announcement after Parliament had made the selection and had processed names and everything shortlisted, and we never got to see whether or not these people are up to equal to the task. And with the leadership campaign, we're hoping really that it becomes the norm more than anything else, that members of the public are able to say, because we want this kind of leader, we are going to participate in the process of looking at the next 5 years. Whoever comes after this person needs to be better than they are in these areas, and they need to be able to implement these functions.
One positive I can take from it is that it's really woken us up a little bit into kind of now asking those questions. As Valencia's pointed out, what kind of leaders do we want to see? We're in this democracy, but are we active as citizens? Are we asking the questions? Do we have the safety nets there for us when we want to speak out? We have the rights. We have one of the best constitutions in the world, where we are protected, our rights are protected to be able to become active citizens in this way. And so I want to leave with that and conclude with that we have those rights, and we must continue to exercise them. And I think, if anything that I've seen over this past year, is great efforts from all of civil society organizations and activists and communities in really, really just putting their foot down and saying, enough is enough. I want answers now. I'm tired of this, and I really, yeah, things need to change. And so with that, I think the responsibility lies with ourselves to actually go and make and demand better leaders and expect more from our leaders. We want to ask the questions, but not just ask them, but also be able to get the answers back that we deserve. And just on the last point, looking at the private sector, I wanted to mention that Open Secrets is going to release its investigative report called On the Enablers of State Captain, that will be coming out early next year, looking at the role of the banks, the lawyers, and the auditors. Yes, so be ready for that. I think it's going to be really powerful, because those actors we always look at our government, but we also need to look at the bigger picture. There's lots of other players involved, and I really appreciated, Tracy, you mentioned, like also looking at the private sector and, making them more aware and conscious and kind of working in a better way that benefits us both. A win-win situation, doesn't have to be a win-lose, I believe, yeah. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.